This is episode 4 of the Byzantine Empire series. Far from the palace, farmers could harvest in peace, and children could study sacred texts in monastery schools. All the while, Basil's ministers recorded every decree intact in sturdy ledgers, as methodical and reliable as the coins in the imperial coffers. One of Basil's lasting reforms was the establishment of the Varangian Guard. These were warriors from Scandinavia and the Rus lands who served as the emperor's personal guard. They were known for their loyalty, for they were foreigners far from home and bound only to Basil. With them by his side, the emperor felt secure enough to walk among his people and travel through the camps without great fear. These fierce guards would later serve future emperors and become legendary themselves. But it was Basil who gave them a place at the heart of the empire's military structure. Throughout all of this, Basil remained accessible to his people. He insisted that local governors and judges handle disputes justly following the laws he upheld. Displeasure of the public could be voiced, but only within the bounds of the law. In Basil's time, overt rebellion was rare because people saw that the emperor's court punished corruption and rewarded service. By meeting with envoys and hearing petitions, often at the same plain wooden desk he used for military dispatches, Basil made sure that even the distant provinces felt the presence of the throne. He was not a figure on a distant pedestal, but an emperor who moved through his realm with steady purpose. Beyond laws and armies, Basil II was known for his personal humility and discipline. He lived simply, in both dress and manner. Court chroniclers note that he usually wore a modest dark purple robe, without the glitter of jewels that many emperors favored. When he ate, he often took the same coarse rye bread and thin broth as his soldiers did. This austere lifestyle won him respect among the troops and subjects alike. They saw an emperor who did not distance himself from the hardships of the camp. His dedication extended to caring for those who served him. Basil is said to have taken orphan children of fallen soldiers into his own household. These children grew up in the imperial palace and received education and protection, becoming part of the next generation of loyal Byzantines. To a simple peasant, it meant that the emperor of the Romans was a man who remembered the losses of war in the quietest ways. Such deeds, though not trumpeted with fanfare, built loyalty and a sense of shared destiny across the empire. Basil's faith also guided his rule. A devout Christian, he attended church services with sincerity. Legend holds that he even took a vow of celibacy. He never married or had children, choosing instead to devote his life entirely to the empire. Some whisper that he saw himself as married to the state and to God. This vow meant that on his death in 1025, there was no heir of his own line, but during his life it meant complete focus. He poured his care and energy into Byzantium as if it were his sole family. Even in the winter months when the palace stoves were lit, Basil often wore furs and simple sandals instead of silks. On campaign he sat the same way as any other officer, on the ground among his men. His great laugh, recorded by some writers, could be heard echoing in the silent mountain passes as easily as in the grand halls of the palace. In truth, Basil II governed without show. He let his actions, victories and reforms alike, speak for him. When Basil II's long life came to an end in December 1025, the Byzantine Empire was at the height of its power. It was as if the candle of his 50-year reign had burned down to a gentle glow that still warmed the empire. He died in his bed in Constantinople at the age of 67 and was buried simply at the Church of St. John outside the city walls. His passing was not marked by loud mourning. Instead, the people felt a peaceful gratitude. Through Basil's efforts, the northern borders of the empire were quiet for decades. The eastern frontiers were secure, and the treasury was full of gold. For the next generation, Basil's legacy loomed large. The empire he left behind continued to thrive for a time. His brother Constantine VIII succeeded him without bloodshed. The army he trained and the borders he set lasted for years, allowing later emperors to enjoy the peace he had secured. Far away in Rus lands, his name was remembered as well. By arranging the marriage of his sister Anna to Prince Vladimir of Kiev in 988, Basil had helped bring Christianity and Byzantine culture to the north. The Varangian Guard remained an elite force in Constantinople for centuries. In that way, Basil's reach extended even beyond his own borders, like ripples from a stone dropped in a quiet pond. In Byzantium and Greece, people came to regard Basil II almost as a folk hero. They spoke softly of the Bulgar slayer, not so much for the violence, but for the triumph over a long, threatening war. Children heard stories of the empire's height under Basil, and scholars called his reign the zenith of the Macedonian dynasty. To some of his subjects he was seen as a wise shepherd of the people, to former enemies a conqueror who had brought change. Even today, historians note that no emperor before him had achieved such successes in warfare and governance together. On a calm night in Constantinople, one might quietly reflect on Basil II's era. Under his rule, the empire's lamps burned steadily, neither flickering with fear nor exploding with uncontrolled flame. It was a time of order and strong institutions, a time when the great ship of Byzantium sailed under one able pilot. As sleep comes, and the empire of the past fades into dreams, the story of Basil II remains a gentle testament to patient strength and careful rule, a peaceful chapter in the long history of Byzantium. Emperor Basil II, the great Macedonian, had shepherded the Byzantine Empire to its height by the time he laid down his purple mantle in late 1025. In the golden light of early winter, the aged emperor breathed his last. His throne passed not to a son, for Basil had none, but to his younger brother, Constantine VIII. The city of Constantinople, resting on its ancient walls and watching the vessels of the Bosphorus drift below, awoke to a new chapter in its long story. Constantine, a man in his late 60s, ascended the throne with quiet resolve. He was a gentle figure who preferred the hush of the palace to the clamor of war. Long overshadowed by his brother Basil's energetic rule, he had little appetite for military campaigns or the rough work of statecraft. Instead, he found comfort in the familiar pleasures of palace life. Sumptuous banquets lit by candlelight, the soft laughter echoing through pillared halls, and the familiar excitement of the hippodrome's chariot races. His touch on the levers of government was light. Without Basil's stern oversight, the intricate machinery of state began to turn more slowly. For the people of Constantinople, life went on much as before. Shopkeepers opened their stalls at dawn, and children played along the harbor under the cool morning sky. Yet within the marble walls of the great palace, a quiet tension had settled. Constantine had no sons to inherit the throne, and he was already in his late 60s. All eyes turned to his daughters from an earlier marriage, Zoe and Theodora, two older women of imperial blood, and a younger daughter, Eudokia, who had become a nun after child. With no male heir, the emperor knew that his lineage would continue only through these daughters, and whichever husband might be chosen for them. The emperor himself moved slowly as winter turned to spring. His days began with gentle ceremony. By morning, the palace gardens were warmed by small braziers to chase away the chill, and attendants helped Constantine bathe with perfumed oils before the sun touched the horizon. In the stillness of dawn, one might imagine the emperor strolling through orange groves and colonnades, alone with his thoughts. At midday, he perhaps knelt in the palace chapel beneath its gleaming mosaics, praying softly or listening to chanting. In the late afternoon, he might find a quiet seat in the hippodrome to watch the chariot races, smiling gently as his favored horse thundered past. Even in these peaceful moments, Constantine remained mindful of his duty. He knew the question of succession would soon have to be answered. By the time summer came, the choice was clear. Zoe, still in her late 40s and as graceful as ever, became the key to succession. In 1028, Constantine arranged for Zoe to marry Romanos Argyros, a nobleman of the city who had served as its prefect. On their wedding day, Romanos was crowned Emperor Romanos III. Zoe became empress beside him. Theodora, who had long lived in a monastery, did not share the throne, for now Zoe alone guided the empire's fate. Romanos III's early years on the throne were a mix of piety and trouble. He tried to strengthen the realm by favoring the great landowners. Some taxes on aristocratic estates were lowered in hopes of earning their loyalty, but this soon drained the treasury's coffers. To refill them, Romanos spent lavishly on the church, gilding icons, funding new monasteries, and endowing golden altars. By the end of the decade, much of the state's wealth had been given to holy works and charity. Outside the palace, dangers still lurked at the edges of the empire. In 1030, for example, Romanos led a campaign against the emir of Aleppo, but suffered a harsh defeat. This loss served as a reminder that the empire's strength in the field had begun to fade. Amid these troubles, the marriage of Zoe and Romanos grew strained. Romanos became known to prefer the company of a mistress, and often kept the palace doors closed to Zoe. The empress, still vigorous at 50, quietly allied herself with Michael, a charismatic young cousin of Romanos's close friend. By late 1034, Romanos had fallen ill and was found dead in his bath one morning. Whether by chance or conspiracy, his reign had ended abruptly, leaving the throne once again without a strong hand. Almost at once, Zoe chose another emperor. In late 1034, she married Michael, the very relative who had become her confidant. Michael was proclaimed Michael IV, co-emperor beside Zoe. Theodora remained in her convent at this time. Michael IV was lively and intelligent, but as an outsider he needed guidance. He relied almost entirely on his older brother John, a crafty eunuch who had long served at court. John the Orphanotrophos now effectively ran the day-to-day government, and his ambition soon tested the patience of both nobles and commoners. Michael IV's reign was not peaceful. despite the new regime. John tried to restore the treasury by changing the tax system. Large estates that had once paid in kind, grain, wine, or labor, were now ordered to pay in coin instead. Many provincial farmers, unused to this requirement, found the demand burdensome. Resentment quietly grew in the countryside. In 1040, a leader named Peter Delian rose in revolt among the Bulgars, claiming descent from the old Tsars. He captured cities like Belgrade and Skopje before the rebels were betrayed from within and the uprising showed how tense conditions had become. Trouble also simmered in the west. General George Maniakis had won glory in Sicily fighting the Muslims, but in 1041 he was recalled to Constantinople amid palace intrigue, weakening the Byzantine hold on Italy. Meanwhile, Michael IV himself was increasingly troubled by his illness. Epilepsy gripped him more each year, and by 1041 he knew he would not long survive. He followed the dynasty's example and retired to a monastery, where he died at ease, with the prayers of monks around him. The young emperor who followed was barely more than a boy. Michael V Calaphates seized power in late 1041. Zoe and Theodora, who might have expected to regain prominence, found themselves set aside. Michael V quickly made a bold move. He had Empress Zoe sent off to a distant convent and kept Theodora under strict guard to silence her. This heavy-handed ruler hoped to erase the old dynasty entirely and rule alone. But in Constantinople, the people remembered Zoe and Theodora as the true heirs of the empire. In the spring of 1042, the populace rose up in revolt, demanding the sisters' return. Faced with the uprising, Michael V abdicated. The sisters were escorted back in triumph from their exile and once again donned the imperial purple together. Now in April 1042, Zoe and Theodora ruled side by side. By Zoe's side, they soon selected a husband to help govern. She turned to Constantine Monomachos, a wealthy and cultured noble she had long admired from afar. Within weeks, Constantine was recalled from exile and wedded to Zoe. In June 1042 he was crowned emperor, Constantine IX Monomachos. Theodora accepted this new arrangement. For a time, the empire was led by the unusual trio of Zoe, Theodora, and Constantine IX. For a short while, the great palace hummed with calm purpose. The sisters aimed to correct the wrongs of recent years. They banned the outright sale of offices, punished past corruption, and appointed capable officials. The scholar Michael Psellos and other intellectuals came to the court at Constantine's invitation, sitting in lamp-lit chambers to discuss philosophy and science. Theodora, often reserved, contented herself with prayer and advising her sister. Zoe, now in her late 60s, still guided state affairs with steady determination. Outside the capital, however, danger gathered quietly. Constantine IX favored culture and faith, building churches and supporting the arts, but he gave little thought to the legions. In 1043, one of the empire's most celebrated generals, George Maniakis, raised his banner in revolt after feeling dishonored at court. In 1047, another noble, Leo Tornikios, a nephew of Constantine, also rebelled and even marched toward Constantinople with an army, only to withdraw when the city stood firm. Each revolt was quashed, but they marked a worrying trend. Beyond these revolts, the empire's old enemies pressed in. Norman knights from the west began capturing Byzantine lands in southern Italy. Bands of Pecheneg horsemen harassed the Balkan frontiers from the north. Most ominous of all, to the east beyond the Taurus Mountains, the Seljuk Turks were growing stronger each year. The once mighty Byzantine army, worn thin by years of meager support, struggled to meet these challenges. Emperor Constantine IX had indeed built splendid new monasteries and given gifts to his aristocratic friends, but he could spare fewer men and coins for the frontier armies. In the autumn of 1050, the final echo of the Macedonian line faded. Empress Zoe, who had outlived 3 husbands, fell ill and died in Constantinople. She had never borne a child to inherit the throne. Constantine IX mourned her privately, but the state moved on with Theodora at his side. 4 years later, in 1056, Theodora too passed away. With the sisters gone, the era of the ancient Macedonian dynasty came to its end. These years from 1025 to 1056 were not marked by sweeping epics or great conquests. Instead, they were shaped by subtle currents at court and among the great families. Palace intrigues and rivalries turned wheels in velvet-lit chambers rather than on the battlefield. Each emperor who sat on the throne did so under the watchful eyes of other powerful figures, eunuchs, nobles, and clergy, all of whom influenced decisions quietly. Wealth flowed, often not to armies, but to churches and favored courtiers, and the frontier soldiers felt the strain. By 1056, Constantinople's golden skyline still welcomed each dawn, but the quiet schemes of these years had already set the empire on a new course. For centuries, the Christian church had been the common spiritual home for millions across the Mediterranean and beyond. Yet by the mid-11th century, it had become a world divided in practice, culture, and belief. The Great Schism of 1054 refers to the formal split between the Western Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. It was not a sudden rupture, but the culmination of centuries of gradual estrangement. In calm and measured tones, this story unfolds slowly and deliberately, tracing the complex background, the key figures involved, and its far-reaching consequences. In the first centuries after Christ, the church was broadly united, even as it already had important centers of leadership. The major patriarchates of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem served Christian communities from Spain to Syria. When Emperor Constantine I in the early 4th century refounded the city of Byzantium as New Rome, Constantinople, the center of power shifted eastward. Over time, Constantinople grew as a leading center of Christianity, just as the old city of Rome remained a significant center of the Western Church. Language, culture, and even theological style began to diverge between East and West. What were at first subtle differences became more pronounced over time. The Western Church developed under the Latin language and Roman legal traditions, while the Eastern Church spoke Greek and drew on Greek philosophy and Byzantine political models. Each side often thought about faith and church governance in different ways. The decline of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century further separated the two spheres. And though imperial unity collapsed under pressure from invading tribes, while in the East, the Byzantine Empire remained powerful and maintained a strong alliance between church and state. The Byzantine emperor often presided over church councils and was seen as God's anointed protector of the faith in the East. In contrast, the Western Church began to develop its own political role, as seen in the later papal states, for example, and became less tied to any single earthly power. Gradually, mutual misunderstandings and mistrust began to mount. By the 8th and 9th centuries, certain theological questions deepened the divide. One major issue was the Filioque clause in the Nicene Creed. The creed originally stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Western Church had added the Latin word filioque, and the Son, to clarify that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Eastern Church objected on two grounds. It had not been consulted about this change, and it believed the addition diminished the distinct persons of the Trinity. To many in the East, this change seemed an unwarranted innovation and a point of great contention. Other religious practices also differed. The Western Latin Church increasingly required its clergy remain celibate, not marry, whereas in the East, married men could become priests, though bishops were usually chosen from among monks. In the Western liturgy, the bread used for the Eucharist was unleavened, flat bread, whereas in the East it was leavened, like normal bread, symbolizing the risen Christ. To many Eastern Christians, the use of unleavened bread by Latins was unusual. Such differences, once minor, became sources of real irritation between the churches. Beyond theology and ritual, political conflicts pushed the churches apart. In 800, for instance, the Pope in Rome crowned Charlemagne as Roman emperor. The Byzantine Empire in Constantinople saw itself as the true continuation of the Roman state and felt deeply offended by this act. Episodes like this fueled suspicion on both sides. By the 11th century, Western church leaders emphasized the universal authority of the Pope in matters of faith. In contrast, the Eastern Church operated within a Byzantine tradition where the emperor was supreme in worldly affairs and served as protector of the Church. These differences in political structure deepened mutual incomprehension between East and West. By the time of the Schism, the chief leaders were Pope Leo IX, head of the Roman Church from 1049 to 1054, and Patriarch Michael Koserulerios, head of the Church of Constantinople from 1043 to 1058. Leo IX was a pious reformer, determined to strengthen the authority of the Pope and to enforce clerical discipline in the Western Church. Michael Koserulerios was an ambitious patriarch who vigorously defended Eastern customs and the autonomy of his church. Each man believed strongly in the validity of his own tradition and was equally certain that the other's practices were in error. Trouble was brewing in the Byzantine world in the early 1050s. The Normans, who were conquering southern Italy, had begun replacing Greek Eastern bishops with Latin Western ones in lands that had been under Byzantine control. This inflamed passions. In 1053, Patriarch Michael Koserulerios took a bold step. He closed all the Latin Rite churches in Constantinople in protest. He accused the Western clergy of diluting the faith with strange customs. For the Western Christians who remained in the city, this meant that they were forbidden to worship in their usual way. In the West, Pope Leo IX and his advisors heard about these actions and reacted forcefully. They saw Eastern measures as a breach of Christian unity. Roman clerics sent letters of protest. Bishop Leo of Ohrid, a subordinate of Koserulerios, had written a harsh pamphlet criticizing Western practices, such as the use of unleavened bread and the Western fasting rules. Pope Leo IX replied in 1053, defending Roman customs and insisting on the privileges of the See of Peter, even citing the donation of Constantine, which was then believed genuine. The exchanges grew more pointed as each side insisted on its rights, laying the groundwork for a bitter dispute. In the spring of 1054, a papal legation arrived in Constantinople, led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, jointed by two other envoys. Their mission was partly secular. Emperor Constantine IX had asked the Pope for military assistance against the Norman invaders. But the papal legates also had ecclesiastical tasks. They were to negotiate over disputed church practices and to insist that the patriarch respect the Pope's authority. Cardinal Humbert, a strong believer in papal supremacy and a man of forceful personality, wasted no time confronting the patriarch. The discussions in the imperial capital were tense and unfruitful. Patriarch Michael refused to give in on Eastern customs or to acknowledge that his title, Ecumenical Patriarch, was inappropriate. He reportedly argued that if the Emperor of Byzantium was called Augustus, then his bishop might properly bear the title of Patriarch of the Emperors, or Ecumenical Patriarch. Humbert insisted that ultimate authority lay with the successor of St. Peter in Rome. Neither man was willing to compromise, and the talks ended in stalemate. On July 16, 1054, the Saturday before Palm Sunday, Cardinal Humbert took a dramatic step. As the divine liturgy began in the great church of Hagia Sophia, he approached the altar and placed on it a parchment. This was the papal bull of excommunication aimed at Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his followers. Humbert quietly laid down the parchment, gave a small blessing, shook the dust off his feet, and departed the church. The scroll's text declared Michael and his followers cut off from communion with the Western Church. The reaction from the Patriarch was swift. About a week later, Michael Cerularius convened a council of Greek bishops in Constantinople. There, he officially excommunicated Cardinal Humbert and the other papal envoys by name. The Patriarch's decree condemned Humbert as a false monk and declared him accursed. At this point, Pope Leo IX had already died on April 19, 1054, so Humbert's mission had no authority to carry out such a sentence. Michael's decree therefore applied only to the legates personally, and not to the office of the Pope. It is important to note that the events of 1054, though dramatic, did not immediately erect an unbridgeable wall between East and West. Many contemporaries still hoped for reconciliation. Negotiations continued on other matters, especially the shared concern about the advance of the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. In 1095, for example, Pope Urban II called for a crusade to aid Byzantium against the Turkish threat, implying that the churches had not completely severed ties. Yet the papal bull in Hagia Sophia and the Patriarch's response were a watershed moment. From that point on, Eastern and Western Christianity drifted further apart, rarely meeting in fellowship. In the years after 1054, relations between East and West ebbed and flowed, but trust was hard to rebuild. Many ordinary Christians continued their local worship with little change in daily life, largely unaware of the exact status of church relations. However, the gap grew wider. Over the 12th century, political and cultural conflicts deepened the rift. Western crusading armies passing through Byzantine lands sometimes treated Greeks as untrustworthy allies, and rumors about Western customs fanned old grievances. In 1182, anti-Western riots in Constantinople led to a massacre of Italian Latin residents in the city. Such violence and later reprisals, for example, a Latin attack on Thessalonica in 1185, further increased mutual hostility. The most dramatic blow to any hope of reunion came in 1204. During the Fourth Crusade, Western Crusaders unexpectedly diverted from the Holy Land and sacked Constantinople itself. The city and its churches were looted, and many treasures were lost. A Latin Catholic empire was proclaimed in Constantinople, and a Latin patriarch was installed to replace the Eastern patriarch. Orthodox Christians were forced to accept the authority of Latin clergy, and the Byzantine Empire was divided among various Crusader rulers. This event left the Eastern Christians deeply embittered and made reunion nearly impossible. These political tragedies only reinforced the original religious split. In the 13th and 15th centuries, councils in the West made further attempts to heal the breach, The Council of Lyon in 1274 and the Council of Ferrara-Florence in 1439 negotiated agreements of reunion with the Byzantine emperors. In each case, the Pope negotiated terms that the emperors and some Greek bishops accepted on paper, hoping for Western military aid against the Ottoman Turks. But most clergy and lay people in the East rejected these unions, viewing them as betrayals of Orthodox tradition. For the Byzantine Empire, the schism had dire consequences. By the late Middle Ages, the empire could no longer count on meaningful help from Western Europe, even in times of crisis. Over the next centuries, without Western aid and weakened by the Crusades and internal strife, the empire gradually lost territory and finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. In cultural terms, however, the Eastern Empire continued its own distinct Orthodox Christian life. The Orthodox Church endured under Ottoman rule, maintaining its traditions, even as the political unity of the old empire was lost. Across Christianity more broadly, the Great Schism cemented the existence of two distinct traditions. Western Europe developed into the Roman Catholic Church under the leadership of successive popes and a centralized hierarchy. Eastern Christianity evolved into the Eastern Orthodox Communion, with national churches in Greece, Russia, Bulgaria, and elsewhere, each led by its own patriarch. The two communions came to see each other as sister churches that had fallen into error. Each side generally maintained that it alone preserved the fullness of the Christian faith. In later centuries, some hope for dialogue gradually arose. In the 20th century, leaders like Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I sought gestures of healing. In 1965, they jointly revoked the ancient mutual excommunications of 1054, acknowledging the shared faith of Catholics and Orthodox, even as important differences remained. More recently, theological dialogues and joint statements have recognized each other's sacraments and saints, even if full unity has not been restored. The shadow of 1054 has gradually lifted enough that by the 21st century, relations between East and West are marked more by conversation than by outright hostility. Christian pilgrims and scholars travel between Rome and Constantinople, now Istanbul, with respect for their shared heritage. The deep estrangement that had once been symbolized by opposing bulls of excommunication has, in gentle ways, lessened. In meditation on this ancient schism, one sees how decades of small disagreements and mutual suspicion can accumulate into a great divide. Yet even after centuries, devoted believers on both sides continue to pray for unity. The story of 1054 is thus told calmly and factually, as a lesson in history and humility. Together, one may reflect on how time and dialogue continue to bridge what anger once divided. By the mid-11th century, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire had enjoyed centuries of splendor, yet signs of strain were visible. Far to the west, the great armies that once roamed Anatolia had not mustered in strength for many years. In Constantinople, the imperial palace was still rich and grand, but its rulers had grown complacent. When Emperor Basil II died in 1025, his disciplined forces began to fray. Empires are steady when borders are guarded, and the barriers to Anatolia, the high mountains, rivers, and long garrisoned fortresses, were thinning. Under later emperors such as Constantine IX and Constantine X, large standing armies were disbanded, leaving the frontiers guarded mainly by local peasants and hastily raised levies. Generals warned that the state of an army can be seen by how it treats its citadels and peasants. In the decades after Basil's death, Byzantine imperial attention shifted elsewhere, to court politics, tax struggles, and conflict with the Normans in Italy. The great tagmatic regiments had shrunk. Imperial coinage was poured into mercenaries rather than veteran soldiers. In Anatolia, shadowy reports came of scattered Turkish bands crossing the frontier, taking isolated castles or raiding villages. In one shattering moment in the 1060s, even Caesarea, a principal city in Cappadocia, fell to one such raid. These losses jarred the West Romans, Byzantines, from apathy. At the imperial court, there was a sense of foreboding. Wise elders whispered that the empire's bulwarks were slowly rusting. The great tagmata of Asia had dwindled to mere skeletons. Supplies were scarce, war horses few. When a promising general named Romanos Diogenes married the Empress Eudokia and became emperor in 1068, he found himself facing a grave inheritance. The frontier was in a pitiful state, as one contemporary wrote later. Across the sea in Italy, the Normans were pressing against Byzantine possessions there. Only the hard truth remained. Byzantium was stretched thin, and danger gathered quietly along its eastern horizon. Romanos IV was a soldier, born to a military family in Cappadocia. Tall and well-built, he had carved his reputation fighting the empire's enemies on the edges of the map. When Eudokia Macrembolitissa, the widow of the late Emperor Constantine X, vowed not to remarry, she was only making a promise until necessity forced her hand. Catastrophe in Anatolia brought her to Romanos when the Turkish commander Afshin stormed and sacked Caesarea. It became clear that only a seasoned general could save what remained. In early 1068, the empress agreed to wed Romanos and crown him basileus, emperor. The people accepted this choice for the moment, though in secret, not all were pleased. Romanos understood his role at once. He swore that he would protect the young Ducas princes of the former dynasty, and he pledged to face the enemies who had crept across the eastern borders. Under his rule, the court's gold was poured back into recruiting and repairing the army. The old imperial fortunes were split between paying troops and building up the navy in the west. At first, his campaigns met with modest success. He recaptured a few fortresses and even scored a victory against a Turkish incursion in 1069. But these gains were patchwork, and the looming threat of a full-scale invasion by the Seljuk Turks remained. Across Anatolia's hills, the great Seljuk Empire was expanding steadily. In Persia and Iraq, they built cities. In Syria and the Levant, they conquered lands once under Christian or Arab rule. By the early 1070s, Sultan Alp Arslan had united the Seljuk realm and was proving a determined and skillful leader. He faced his own problems in the south, especially the Fatimid Caliphate, so he preferred to keep a wary peace with Constantinople for the moment. The Seljuks were Turks from the steppes, fierce riders and archers who practiced the old steppe warfare. Unlike the disciplined Roman legions or their successor heavy cavalry, these warriors fought from horseback with hit-and-run tactics. As Romanos ascended the throne, that enemy was pressing closer to home. Small bands had taken villages and farms earlier. A long siege had forced the fall of the city of Ani, 1064. By 1070, the Seljuks were active around the border forts. The Byzantine frontier in Anatolia was restless and dangerous. Despite the growing pressure, Alp Arslan at first made no immediate strike. In 1069, a truce had been agreed with Romanos, and it held, but only momentarily. Both sides knew it was a temporary breath. Romanos needed time to gather troops and prepare. Alp Arslan was focused on his Syrian campaigns against the Fatimids. This alignment of interests allowed a brief lull in hostilities. Romanos planned to use that pause to his advantage. He realized that to secure Byzantium's future, he had to deal with the Turkish problem once and for all. In the spring of 1071, having dealt with the Normans as best he could, he even paid off some Norman mercenaries and sent others home. Romanos looked east. He sent envoys to Alp Arslan, ostensibly to renew the 1069 truce. The Sultan, pleased to concentrate on Egypt and Syria, agreed, but the peace was a ruse. Unaware of Alp Arslan's true intentions, or perhaps counting on underestimating them, Romanos assembled a large army and marched into Armenia in June 1071. His goal was to quickly recover the scattered border forts around Lake Van before the Sultan could respond. Roughly 40,000 men followed him, imperial guards, provincial levies, and units from Asia and Europe. Mixed among them rode Armenian archers, Bulgarian footmen, Georgians, and even a few Western knights, led by a Norman named Roussel. Altogether, they carried the emperor's standard. The journey was arduous. The long baggage train carried luxuries and supplies for many months, making the pace slow. Along the way, local populations could do little but watch and hope for protection. At night, the campfires flickered beneath distant peaks. Romanos would sometimes consult with his generals around the glow. The army finally reached Sebastia, near modern Savas, and then passed through Theodosiopolis, Erzurum, by June's end. Some commanders advised making camp there and waiting for the Turks. Others urged immediate pursuit. The emperor, proud and determined, chose to continue. He was eager perhaps to deal a decisive blow that would restore his empire's security. After a rest at the city of Kinus, Romanos moved out. The soldiers harvested wood for spears by the Kokasu stream. He believed that Alp Arslan's main army was far to the south near Aleppo, and that the fortress of Manzikert was lightly held. In truth, the Sultan had moved swiftly once news came of the Byzantine advance. By late August, Alp Arslan's own force of cavalry, perhaps 30,000 strong, including allies from Aleppo and Mosul, had drawn close to Lake Van and into the hills that overlooked the plain where Manzikert sat. Scout reports knew Romanos's every move, but he did not realize how near the enemy had crept. As the emperor neared Manzikert, he split his forces. General Joseph Tarchoniotes took roughly half the army, including the Varangian Guard and a mixed column of Frankish and Pecheneг mercenaries, to secure the fortress of Kliat, nearby. Romanos himself marched with the rest toward Manzikert, modern-day Malazgirt, a fortified town not far from the lake. This division was risky. According to later historians, Tarchoniotes' detachment may have been routed or simply dissolved when it met the real Seljuk army. In any case, Romanos' own host was now smaller and more exposed. On the morning of August 23rd, 1071, Emperor Romanos entered Manzikert itself. The town's walls and fortresses opened before him without a fight. Seljuk garrisons had fled or disbanded. Romanos, with his banners unfurled, took possession of the town. His troops looted the camp. For a moment, they celebrated, believing the worst was over. But already, the air was filling with the whinny of distant horses and the sharp cry of Turkic warchiefs. Scouts and foraging parties from the Byzantines had begun to encounter skirmishes beyond the city walls. By nightfall of that day, Romanos knew that the enemy was nearby, in force. In the cool dusk, he met his commanders. The very next morning, on August 24th, he formed his army on the open plain outside Manzikert. The sun was high, and the stubble fields of late summer were golden beneath the sky. Romanos arrayed his men for battle. Theodore Aliates, commanding the right wing, Nikephoros Bryennios, the left, and the emperor himself holding the center. Behind them, in the rear and reserve, marched Andronikos Doukas, a nobleman from the family that had once ruled the empire. Andronikos had been an uneasy presence ever since joining the army. Some suspected that old court rivalries smoldered in his mind. Opposing them, the Seljuks held the ground in a broad crescent formation. Horse archers swarmed in long rows, wearing helmets of lambskin and armor of laminate, their bows strung and arrows poised. At dawn's first light, on August 25th, arrows began to fly. The sound was like rain on tin as the Seljuk cavalry danced forward, peppering the Byzantines. Romanos and his men pressed on, hardening their shield wall against the hail of arrows. The Byzantines launched a charge toward the Seljuk center. The fighting was fierce and confusing. By mid-afternoon, Romanos' cavalry managed to break through and capture the Seljuk camp. They took slaves and treasure from the tents, pulling down the enemy's standards. For a moment, Romanos thought victory was at hand. But outside the camp, the archers of Alp Arslan had simply fallen back, drawing the Byzantines deeper into the trap. Romanos sent more squadrons forward, but each was met with a retreating column that looked as if it fled, then wheeled suddenly to fire arrows at point-blank range. The Byzantine line strained to hold. Under constant attack, both wings began to stretch thin. On the left, Bryennios's men fought doggedly, but many were cut down or driven back. On the right, Aleatis's troops fared similarly. Romanos shouted encouragement and signals, but the step tactics of the Turks, feigned retreats and swift assaults from unexpected angles, sapped his forces. As the afternoon waned, Romanos realized the danger of keeping them out in the field overnight. He gave the signal to disengage and fall back in good order before darkness. This moment proved tragic for the Byzantines. As the sun sank, confusion set in. On the right flank, Aleatis did not hear the order to retreat and continued to advance until he was surrounded by Turks. In the center, when Romanos gave word to start withdrawing, Andronikos Doukas at the rear did not move to cover the withdrawal. Instead, he suddenly spurred his horse and fled toward the Byzantine camp. Whether he meant to abandon the field outright or simply misunderstood, his action left the emperor's troops exposed. By nightfall, the Byzantine army lay in disarray. Hearing the horn orders, one by one the soldiers began to pull back. Murmurs spread among them. Had the emperor given up? Some said they had been betrayed by the Armenians or by the Turkic auxiliaries who knew the secret signs of retreat. With discipline crumbling, the Seljuks smelled victory. Before dawn on August 26th, the light-skinned plains were filled with the clatter of horses and cries as the Seljuk cavalry swept in on the unsuspecting Byzantines. The Byzantine right wing under Aleatis was cut to pieces. The left wing under Bryennios was eventually driven back through the dust and shattered. The emperor himself, with some of his bodyguard, the famed Varangian guards among them, held the center. Romanos rode at their head, urging calm and pulling back into a tight circle formation, but the enemy was closing in. Arrow shafts spat out spells of death. Romanos felt one slender shaft strike his side. The pain was sharp, but he remained in the saddle. All around him, the doomed remnants of the imperial army fought valiantly. Fierce Armenian foot soldiers at the emperor's side fought to the last. According to some accounts, Romanos promised them great rewards for their loyalty, but numbers were against them. By mid-morning, the circle had been breached. Albanian and Varangian guardsmen dropped their axes or swords only when pressed from behind. Slowly the center collapsed. In the chaos, Romanos himself was unhorsed. Some say by a fall, others say by an arrow, and wounded. He was surrounded by Seljuk horsemen. There was no more organized Byzantine resistance. On the open hilltop, the proud army of the East Romans was broken. By nightfall on August 26, most Byzantine soldiers had fled into the night. Only a few stragglers would later make it back to friendly lines. In a half-light clearing, Romanos IV found himself brought before Alp Arslan. The Sultan had not expected to see the emperor in such a state, dust and bloodied from head to foot. First, Arslan hesitated, not sure that this ragged man could really be the emperor of the Romans. Once identity was confirmed, the protocol of victory was clear. According to custom, an emperor taken captive was to kiss the victor's boot, a symbolic gesture of submission. If any man could have stripped away Romanos's dignity, this would have. Yet after that formal gesture, something remarkable happened. The Sultan of the Seljuks treated Romanos with respect. For a week, Romanus was a guest of Alp Arslan. He was allowed to share meals with the Sultan and his court, better food than prison fare. His captor ensured his wounds were tended. Arslan even repeated the peace terms he had previously offered. Romanus could keep his title and most of the empire if he ceded a few frontier fortresses and agreed to pay an annual tribute of gold. He asked, for example, that the cities of Antioch, Edessa, Hierapolis, and Manzikert themselves be delivered to Seljuk control. The terms were harsh, but Romanus had little choice. He agreed to them, promising to fulfill them once he returned home. Before releasing him, Alp Arslan gave Romanus valuable gifts: silken cloaks, horses, a large escort of chosen emirs to accompany him. In parting, he even prepared a marriage alliance, a promised union between Romanus's daughter and one of the Sultan's sons. Once he had Romanus safely on the road home, Alp Arslan turned back to his own lands, satisfied that the great Byzantine threat had been disarmed for now. When Romanus returned to Constantinople, he came as a man both honored and broken. The gifts he carried made people's eyes widen, but the silence fell quickly. The city's mood was uneasy. Word had arrived earlier, even before the emperor got home, that his army had been defeated. When news of the terms leaked, panic rippled through the capital. Andronikos Doukas, who had fled during the battle, arrived first in the city with alarming stories. He claimed Romanos had been killed and the empire in ruins. He led a faction of courtiers who had long despised the emperor. Seizing the moment, they proclaimed Michael, the young son of Constantine X and a child of Romanos's late predecessor, as the new emperor. In November of 1071, Romanos IV was deposed in his absence. Michael VII Ducas, still in his teens, was declared Basileus, king, in Romanos' stead. Romanos did not give up. As soon as he returned from captivity, he began to gather troops loyal to him. The loyal Varangians and a handful of commanders, such as Bryennios, formed a small but determined army in Asia Minor. That same autumn, he marched south into Cilicia to confront the Dukai, Michael's family, who had been entrusted with the throne. There, near the castle of Dokeia, he faced them in battle. Despite fighting to reclaim the empire he had won so dearly, Romanos' cause faltered. At a crucial moment, the Dukai forces betrayed the truce they had offered. Romanos was captured, again. But this time, the Sultan was no longer there to protect him. He had fallen into the hands of his domestic enemies. In cruel fashion, Romanos was blinded, a common Byzantine punishment for deposed emperors, and sent into exile on an island in the Sea of Marmara. Just days later, he succumbed to infection from the blinding wounds and died. His story ended poorly for a man who had once ruled and bled for an empire. Meanwhile, the Byzantine army was shattered by this chain of events. The veteran commanders who had fought at Manzikert were now scattered. Some fled to secure holdings in the west. Others swore loyalty to the new regime. But no one was fully in control of the eastern frontier. The army that might have stood against the Turks was embroiled in civil war. To the east, the Seljuks noted this change, like hawks scenting blood. The disaster at Manzikert did not immediately crumble the Byzantine Empire. Historians now believe the immediate losses were not as great as old tales suggest, but its effects were profound and enduring. In the short term, the lords of Anatolia had no strong force behind them. The frontier was left largely unguarded. Turkic raiders and migrating tribes began to trickle through the passes and across the lakeshore, pillaging and settling. In 1072, a year after Manzikert, Alp Arslan was assassinated by a renegade. His successor, Malik Shah, hardly noticed the distant ways of Anatolia. It fell to local Turkoman Ghazi fighters to fill the vacuum. In the years that followed, wave after wave of Turks moved into the void. One of Alp Arslan's former lieutenants, Suleiman, set up a new Turkish kingdom in northwestern Anatolia, centering on Nicaea, Iznik, within sight of Constantinople, by about 1077. Soldiers of fortune poured in, building villages and towns of Turkish culture over the Greek provinces. Episode 5 is on the way. See you soon.